Thank you very much, David, and I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you to the organisers of this excellent conference. I found it very interesting so far. So as David mentioned, I'm a research fellow at ANU, as well as an energy focal point for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra in their climate change area. But I'm presenting today my research at ANU, and as I will explain, I'm part of the hydrogen fuels team, and my research has been very much part of that team. So I really want to acknowledge my co-researchers, especially Dr. Lee White, who's been focusing on hydrogen and ammonia certification with me, as well as my supervisor, Emma Eyes. But next slide, please. So I wanted to do an acknowledgement of country. This is actually quite an important part of our approach at the Grand Challenge, as you'll see. But I'd like to begin my presentation by acknowledging traditional custodians, the Ngunnawal people of the land that I live on here in Canberra, and all traditional custodians across our sun-kissed land here in Australia. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend this respect to all First Nations peoples, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are in attendance today. So the Grand Challenge, very briefly, is an ANU-funded investment of over $10 million over 5 years, and involves 40 plus researchers across all disciplines in the ANU. And next slide, please. And Ken Baldwin is the director of that effort, so you can always reach out to him. So as this slide shows, Asia Pacific decarbonisation is really critical for us, for the world, to avoid catastrophic climate change. And it's an area of growing energy demand. So finding ways to decarbonise that energy consumption is really critical, and Australia has a special role in it, not least due to our geographical proximity to the region. Next, please. Maybe just keep clicking next. But basically, as you can see, we have a lot of exports at the moment that go into the region. And it's interesting to note that 8% of Asia Pacific greenhouse gas emissions are actually from downstream use of Australian exports, such as iron ore, thermal coal, aluminium ores and LNG. Now, if we transfer that to a decarbonised export sector for Australia, green steel, green aluminium, liquefied hydrogen and ammonia, I should say, although that calculation is for hydrogen. The ANU is working on an equivalent calculation for liquefied ammonia, and of course subsea cables up into the Indonesia, Singapore and beyond into an ASEAN grid. So yeah, and that green square is very interesting because it shows how much land in Australia it would take to generate that from especially wind and solar. But we have amazing wind and solar resources in Australia, as well as hydro, etc. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, as I mentioned, the ANU is taking a very integrated and cross-sectoral approach to this challenge. It has 5 teams of researchers. I'm part of the hydrogen fuels team, and I'm working with over a dozen researchers, including secondees from Australian government agencies who are brought in on secondments for some time, and it really helps to build the links, I guess, between the research and the policy making of the Australian government. Next slide, please. So I called the first slide Ammonia's Promise because this was a bit wordy, but the formal title is Ammonia Certification to Support Decarbonisation of International Trade. And I'm just going to minimize that so I can read it, and international trade challenges and opportunities. So looking at the big picture, the thing that's driving decarbonisation of energy and the driver for new fuels is ultimately, obviously, the commitments that countries have made all around the world to avoid catastrophic climate change and the Paris Agreement. So this is very much linked to decarbonisation. In the medium to long term especially, but depending on the level of ambition, of course, and ease of decarbonisation, the moves are already happening across the energy and other sectors. So there are many different words being used about hydrogen and ammonia, clean, green, blue, grey, even turquoise. I read it gets a bit confusing. So I hope my presentation will help to clarify that a bit. So obviously there are two elements that you'd think that buyers and sellers of ammonia will be looking, and hydrogen will be looking to. Price is one very important element, but it really is an integrated view of also the emissions profile. So perhaps obviously hydrogen and ammonia generated with no carbon capture and storage is very cheap, but the emissions profile part of that purchasing and supply decision, perhaps the price is quite high if you actually factor in greenhouse gas emissions. So, and this is happening globally. There are, of course, suppliers and purchasers all around the world. So how the approaches to that nexus between price and emissions will play out in terms of global systems is a very interesting question. And I do hope to get start a discussion perhaps about how we get there. How do we get to a certification system that it has that integration of both price and emissions, so people can make informed decisions. Next slide. So in economic speak, I'm an economist by training. There's an asymmetry of information market failure, as well as, of course, the negative externality of greenhouse gas emissions as well. So without certification, buyers can't know how clean the ammonia is. As everyone knows, NH3 is NH3 at the end point, and without some documentation to say how the NH3 was produced, you can't tell by looking at the product what its embedded emissions are. So this is obviously going to facilitate international trade. Buyers and sellers will have a common understanding in a very objective measurement of both of the emissions profile of the ammonia that's on the market and being sold, and can make their purchasing decision in accordance to their preferences regarding price and emissions. Obviously, it's very important for potential premium pricing of ammonia from renewables to be able to really confidently say that something is zero or low emissions. And Australia's amazing renewable energy resources that we've already heard about are quite critical in this regard. So obviously the system needs to be accepted by potential importers, and there will be a major publication that comes out hopefully later this year from the ANU, and this analysis draws on that. Next slide, please.
Two more minutes.
Uh-oh. Okay, very quickly, this is a great diagram. Look at it if you're a bit confused about what weld the tank and weld the weir and the wheel and cradle the grave and whole of life cycle. This is an excellent diagram to explain the different boundaries for certification. Next slide, please. So keep going. Yeah, so the National Hydrogen Strategy, and it was great to hear from Alan Finkel yesterday, and his self-identification as not only captain of hydrogen, but captain of hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives. So this is what the National Hydrogen Strategy, just keep clicking a couple more times, says that the government, the Australian government, wants to do, and that's the approach they wish to take to certification. Next slide. So yeah, keep clicking. So basically how we get there, Um, Timeliness is very important. Obviously for ammonia, it may be traded at scale, perhaps even sooner than hydrogen. And the shipping and co-firing opportunities we've heard about are quite critical and coming online this decade. It's really important to look at ammonia's certification needs comparatively and in contrast to hydrogens. So there are differences between the two products, different markets, different stakeholders. Some stakeholders are backing hydrogen as the next shipping fuel, others are backing ammonia, and there will be a variety of different corporate interests. And obviously there is a huge political momentum internationally around hydrogen. I'm not sure we could say that momentum is fully reflected in the current governance and discussions around ammonia yet. So there are a couple of options really about how we approach certification of ammonia. Do we just say we'll tack on ammonia to the hydrogen system? And it was interesting to hear Alan Finkel say that ideally the hydrogen certification system will apply to NH3, so that's definitely one option. But how do we also bear in mind the differential needs of ammonia certification next? So finally, and I'll just take a couple of minutes on this slide, please. So it's urgent. The forums that discuss ammonia are few and far between compared with hydrogen. Currently, we have the Ammonia Energy Association and its Australian and other chapters, as well as Japan's very interesting development of the Green Ammonia Consortium, which is a national approach. I'm not sure yet there are national counterparts to that yet, but we'll see how that develops. Ammonia energy trade governance negotiations aren't really happening at the moment, as far as I can tell, between governments, but certainly on hydrogen certification, we have the IPHE. The IMO is also beginning, I think, well, they'll be relevant for discussions for shipping certification systems. And Australia's role in those negotiations as a key energy supplier to the Asia Pacific and beyond will be interesting to see how that develops as we work in Australia with our bilateral partners, particularly in Asia. There will be technical questions around how ammonia is certified and how that's different again to hydrogen. And I'm really interested in hearing from the other speakers this afternoon on those technical issues that I'm not really an expert in. And I wonder about where you draw the boundary, because if you have to freeze or cool hydrogen by a lot of, very strongly, how much energy does that use? So if you say you just have the boundary of production of hydrogen and the production of ammonia and you compare them, they might look quite similar, or even ammonia may be more intensive. But if you look at how much energy you're going to have to use to ship that ammonia or hydrogen to Japan, given the different cooling requirements, it could have quite a big implication for how greenhouse gas efficient ammonia looks vis-a-vis hydrogen. And just one more click and I'm done. Thank you, everyone. If you want to follow up on my research, of course, you can contact me. But I also want to acknowledge that the Grand Challenge has industry partners, and CWP and Andrew Dixon, just want to acknowledge their support. But if any corporates are interested in partnering with the Grand Challenge, they can contact Ken Baldwin. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Penelope, and thanks for that informative presentation. So there's opportunities for questions for Penelope at the end of the session. Keep sending in your questions if you have any, and we'll get to them soon. So up next, we have Martin Hablutzel. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly, Martin, who's a business unit manager at Siemens Energy Pty Ltd. He did present last year in last year's Ammonia conference, and Martin's responsible for hydrogen activities for Siemens in Australia and New Zealand. Has been heavily involved in promoting opportunities for hydrogen technology and across a number of areas, including government dialogue and so on. He was a contributing member of Alan Finkel's National Hydrogen Strategy that was released a year or two ago. His expertise covers a number of areas across the hydrogen technology supply chain and solutions, from electrolysis to electrification, remote area supplies, and so forth. And he'll be talking today about platform-based certification scheme. So over to you, Martin, if you are happy to share your screen. And perfect.
Great, thanks, David. So just checking, people can see the screen and hear me.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So on the topic of certification, and thanks again for having me along today. It's a great topic, and certification, as Penelope sort of already indicated, is a really key enabler for the industry, and that's why in Australia we're particularly interested in it. Just check that I can move to the next slide. Now, in Australia, of course, we are very awake and very interested to export energy because we have a long history of doing so. And therefore, certification to bring trust and credibility to our industry is so critically important. But I'd like to point out that it's not just Australia that sees this. In fact, these excerpts here that I've got on the screen are from the Australian Hydrogen Strategy, the German Hydrogen Strategy, and the European Commission's hydrogen strategies. And each of them recognises the importance of certification. And it's absolutely true that whatever we work on has to be something that's globally accepted, because we're talking about international trade. And it's always good to travel with countries spearheading this, because we certainly talk about wanting to spearhead certification from Australia. I guess it's a bit Eurocentric, and we should also bear in mind, of course, that from Asia, the very strong interest to participate in this trade. It's just working for a German company, I find it easier to come across the European material, and I think it speaks really overall. What I want to put forward today, really though, is as we start to explore the needs for certification, we can approach this from a top-down, meaning describing the requirements of the scheme, and from bottom-up. So I'm going to start with top-down, and what I mean by top-down, the requirements of a scheme, and these are words that I've pulled directly out of those hydrogen strategies. And I'm going to, apologies, use hydrogen in a sort of a word synonymously used with ammonia, because I do subscribe to Alan Finkel's view that ammonia is as a derivative of hydrogen, meaning because for renewable ammonia, of course, we have to go via the renewable hydrogen pathway. These certification scheme needs their direct lift, so we can see the need for robust, it speaks to guarantees of origin, transparency, has to be trusted, swiftly introduced, that's from the European one, so there's an element of speed. So these are all the things that we say an accreditation scheme needs, and these are being quite broadly discussed. What I haven't seen as much of is from the bottom up, what can be done, how, and Penelope asked that question, how do we get there? So I'd like to approach this topic from how, and we're a technology, Siemens is a technology company, so unapologetically, I'm going to talk about a technology solution, which in this case is a platform-based certification scheme. And I'll acknowledge up front, Siemens, of course, manufacture and offer a platform-based solution, but I've described that today's presentation is written in a generic format, and there are other global platform-based solution providers. Amazon Web Services is a very well-known and accepted global platform. And so what I describe here, I'm describing in a generic sense, which should describe the expectations of a cloud-based platform solution. So these are some of the attributes. That it should be cloud-based, meaning that it's not hosted in any, by any one country or jurisdiction, and the costs can then largely scale with its usage, so that a small contributor into the ecosystem isn't laboured with certain higher fixed costs. That's always the beauty of cloud-based solutions. The second point, that the data ownership should remain with the data creator, and extracts of that data are shared into the platform environment to be used for audit and certification and buying and sellers and this type of thing. It should be an open data platform so that apps can be developed. And while, let's imagine we develop a hydrogen certification scheme, further apps, then we can build ammonia onto that. An audit function can be built. Maybe a loss analysis in the context of hydrogen losses from production through to end use. All these kinds of additional needs can then be built on the core platform. Using an existing global platform means that you don't have to rebuild the infrastructure, the setup, and all the administrative functions, permissions and logins and all that. The cost of building something like this could be quite exorbitant whereas by leveraging platform-based solutions, that's already inherent function of all of them. Rapidly deployable by building a minimum viable product, which might only serve the very core needs, the carbon accounting side with hydrogen production. That might be the minimum viable product, and over time can expand to other functions like water usage and even safety management. And importantly, the final one, that cyber security is established and maintained, because it's an ongoing thing. You can never say that job's done. But cybersecurity aspects are protected within the established, major global hydrogen platforms. So that's a list view of what I'm describing. But for those like me who prefer diagrams, I've tried to illustrate that in simple way what it is I'm talking about, and I'll start from the bottom. There are certain data sources which we need to be able to verify the production, to transport, indeed all the way to the dispatching or the refueling infrastructure that goes to the final end use. And some of these data sources would already be software or internet based. And so these would simply need to be passed through to the cloud-based platform. But the other source of data will be at plant level, where hydrogen production is actually taking place. And this might be through meters. I just noticed a spelling mistake. That's not how you spell dispatch. And it could be at refueling infrastructure points. So this is at technical plant level, and that this can also be uploaded into the same platform environment. And it might come via the control system or SCADA environment. Once within, and the only data going up is the data which has been permitted to go up by the owner or the producer of that data. And that it then authorizes that data to be used for certain purposes. Within that, the cloud-based platform environment, the secure environment where the data itself is stored, but on top of which the applications then reside and can be continually built and expanded to meet the emerging needs of what such a scheme might need. And it's inherent in the platform itself, things like the account management, permissions, cyber security. These already come straight out of the box with them. On the right-hand side, the purple boxes, these are the users, so the clients, if you like. So this is where the buyers and sellers can receive the certification and certificates. Auditors can follow the process through and ensure that the data is trusted. And governments themselves, once they look at country level carbon accounting and trade, have a view into that data as well. And really, that's the end of it. I mean, I'm making these slides available for people. I'll jump ahead to one. This is a more complicated view of what I just shared. So that's why I redrew the other one to make it more simple. And there's some other reference material. But in terms of introduction for the panel discussion, that's as much as I wanted to offer at this stage.
You want me to read that out?
That'd be great.
Okay, great. How will product certification be linked with national carbon schemes under a certificates trading scheme? Less carbon intensive ammonia gets less certificates, as a question? Or?
Thanks, David. I can take from there. So, yeah, my question really is, I guess, really interested in the panel members' view of whether we will end up with a product linked scheme. So tons and product needs to be linked to its source, or whether we'll end up with a de-linked scheme where certificates will be freely traded independent of the product. Because basically, in my mind, I see no difference between a cleaner production of ammonia at one location generating a certificate that says you have saved emissions over what it would otherwise be, and that certificate then being traded the same way that renewable energy certificates are traded.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. It's a good question. I think they should be de-linked. And normally when we talk about electricity, we can only do that within the one country. And that is actually what happens. But in time, as international schemes become aligned, we should have that already in mind in the design of a scheme, so that international trade in certificates could run separately from the physical trade in the product. Would be how I'd put that in as a requirement statement already, and then have that in mind in the design and the solution that's being put together.
Penelope, did you have anything to add there? I think one of your colleagues at ANU put something on the chat box. But
yeah. I would defer, I think, to one of my other colleagues to answer that. I haven't looked at it personally, but I have. Obviously, there are two separate approaches that will have different implications for how the system develops and the different players and that international trade in certificates is a really interesting question, which of course is also a live issue in the UNFCCC negotiations as well regarding carbon markets. So I just note, obviously, there are different potential approaches with different pros and cons, and I think, of course, both should be considered, or even some sort of hybrid or dynamic approach where one might be preferred in the short term, but in the longer term, once carbon international markets are maturing, perhaps there could be a greater role for the tradable certificates.
Yeah, I think it could actually even help with the birthing of the industry. For example, we might produce green ammonia in Australia and consume it in Australia without accounting for the green nature of it. And the certificate is purchased and deployed in, let's say, Japan, without the physical transport. That's probably less problematic for ammonia, because ammonia is readily shippable. But in the birthing of the hydrogen industry, where we know that moving hydrogen is very problematic at scale, that would be a good way that you actually start large-scale deployment of hydrogen production technologies, electrolyzers and the like, without yet having to address the transport challenge. And I think having a mechanism like that, now of course it needs a global certificate trading scheme in place, and that's a bigger ocean to boil than what we are capable of in this room. However, that's why I would support Darren's initial proposal of the value of such a thing.
I would just note, and I didn't explicitly say it in my presentation, that there are many different ways to negotiate a certification system, and they're likely to actually occur simultaneously. Yeah. One is, of course, global and multilateral negotiations through organisations like IPHE or whatever body ends up taking ammonia certification on. And simultaneously, there may be regional discussions and negotiations in organisations such as APEC, or obviously bilateral discussions that will be happening between Australia and its key trading partners like Japan. So it's not an either or. All of these things might happen at once, and difficult to negotiate things, say like a bilateral certificate trading scheme, might be easier to start in a bilateral context.
Right.
Thanks, panel members. Yeah, I'd just call out that in terms of a market activation mechanism, there's a huge existing market for ammonia production that could be leveraged if the transport solution can be solved. I personally think it's by far the most complex, and there's a pre-existing movement system that can be utilised if you can, I guess, just prove the cleanliness or otherwise of the supply source.
All right, thanks, thanks Darren, and thanks to the panelists for that question. I've got one here for Penelope from Mark Hindman. If you wanted to unmute Mark, you can present your question. Be great if you could say where you're from as well.
Yeah, I'm from Perth, Australia, and independent consultant. And the question was in regards to geologic storage. Now, if we're looking at export and we're looking at reliable export of the entire value chain, then it's no different to any other commodity, be it oil and gas or salt or iron. You need to have a good feedstock because it actually emits any upset conditions in the power plant or electrolyzers, etc., etc. So having a very good storage facility is really good for a reliable supply of hydrogen or ammonia to an export market, and that's something that they'll certainly be looking for. So my question was really in regards to have we identified prime locations for geologic storage, you know, such as salt caverns, debris, sandstone, etc., etc. I've looked on the government geoscience website, and it has a huge band of where the halite is positioned, and this is a key factor. If you look at the US, it's got a network of pipes and it uses geologic storage. If you look at Germany and the EU papers, the EU papers say that Germany has got it's very heavy in salt, and it's got large salt caverns, and it'd be able to store the hydrogen in those salt caverns. But still, the actual amount of storage capability they've got to actually power up the entire nation, it's not enough. So there'll still be an importer of ammonia and hydrogen. So a very key important component, to me, as I see it, is delivering energy and being an energy exporter and a domestic, building a domestic economy and letting all the tiers 2 to 5 flourish. Geologic storage is key in making this happen. That's my question. Where are we with geologic storage?
Right. So the way I see it, to store hydrogen requires perhaps geologic storage because of its nature and its instability. I'm not sure that ammonia requires a salt cavern to store it. But like if you're exporting ammonia, why would you store it as hydrogen with all the problems that come with that? You would convert it to ammonia at the production place, stick it in a huge tank, and then ship it when the ships turn up at the port or whatever infrastructure you've set up for loading the ships. And thinking about Singapore, if ammonia becomes the key bunkering fuel of the future, certainly Singapore's not going to have salt caverns. They're going to store it in massive, bunkers like they do now for LNG. So I think I don't see the advantage of storing your hydrogen fuel as hydrogen with all the complications and costs that go with that, unless somehow you needed to use it as hydrogen in an approximate location. You don't want to crack it back. So yeah, I think this is again an issue where hydrogen is very different to ammonia, and perhaps ammonia has quite an advantage to it. And ammonia, I would suggest, of course, will end up being a key domestic fuel for Australia, as well as a key fuel for export.
So is ammonia something we can store, have 6 months storage? Is that something possible?
Yeah, I mean, Singapore's going to do it if it becomes a shipping fuel. Can we have 6 months storage of LNG?
Not really, it's in the reservoir. So it is a just-in-time process?
Right.
Ammonia highest storage is about 50,000 metric tons. Tanks were built. It must be the storage tank in the world. 50,000 tons.
So yeah, we might just to have opportunity for some other questions. I just want to get back to the certification topic while we still have it. Thanks, Mark. Hopefully that answered some of your questions. Otherwise, I'm sure the panelists will be happy to take that offline. We've got one question here that I think could be to either of the panelists, and it's around a certification program for sustainable water sources as inputs to green hydrogen ammonia. It was from Leanne. Is that clear enough, or Leanne, did you want to pose that? Okay.
It's Leanne. I'm from Origin Energy. So we are looking at, you know, sustainable water sources for potential hydrogen and ammonia projects. So, you know, given the public perception around Australia being a pretty dry continent, I just wondered if there was any room for a certification program for sustainable water sources to help reduce public perception of, you know, exporting Australia's valuable water source overseas.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So,
go for it. You can go.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it's a good one. And as we define the needs of a certification scheme, we'll go beyond you know, carbon emissions and quickly find some others, like water in particular would come to the fore. But there's a number of other you know, safety topics or social contributions in a broader sense. There's many other dimensions which will also be tracked. The problem in designing a scheme, if we try and build something which addresses all of them right at the beginning, it'll never launch, it'll never get off the ground. And that's why what I've proposed by having a platform-based solution lets you get a minimum viable product, which is the carbon accounting aspect of it. But have those things in mind already so that you can readily build upon them and not build something which then builds out the possibility of adding them at a later stage.
So thanks very much. I agree with what Martin said, but also I want to put it again in the big picture, and I've worked for 10 years in humanitarian assistance in Africa. There's SDG 6, the Sustainable Development Goal, that every country on the planet has lined up for and agreed to. Ensure availability and sustainable water management of water and sanitation for all. So you have to take a holistic view of this. There are many ways of sustainably managing water, and certainly from my perspective, sustainable management of water in the hydrogen and ammonia industry are important, as is sustainable water management in every other kind of fuel that Australia produces, uses and exports, as well as, of course, other ways we use water in agriculture and everywhere else. So the risk is, if you establish a high standard for hydrogen and ammonia when it comes to water sustainability, but you do not have a similar system for the competitor fuels of hydrogen and ammonia, is that a level playing field? What are the implications then for the development of those fuels versus the ones where there is no certification for sustainable water management? So I think this is an area where taking a sector-wide approach perhaps is more likely to deliver sustainable and level playing field outcomes for all the fuels that are subject to a water certification system.
Fantastic. So Leanne, I hope that answered your question. Might move to another one, and this is from for you, Martin, from Igor Scriabin, I think. Igor, did you want to pose that question yourself? I can ask the question. The question was the use if this is around data, I think. So if the use is granted by the data creator, why can't the data be open to everyone?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, and I did a private response to Igor beforehand.
Oh, right.
And what I'm proposing is that a lot of the data that we need for certification actually exists in some form or other within a control system or some other platform already within the producer or transport or refueling. And rather than rebuilding a specialist data collection methodology, simply grant the relevant part of the data necessary for the purpose of certification, grant that data access into the platform without having to recreate the whole thing. This is all about minimizing cost and complexity of a certification solution.
Right, great. And I think, yeah, you did answer that. We've got one question from Doug McFarlane around losses. Doug, did you want to pose that one?
In fact, Martin is, thank you, David. Martin has already sort of answered that question in the chat, and then there's been a bit of a good discussion in the chat as well, if anybody wants to follow it. But maybe I'll just summarize that the issue I think we should all keep an eye on, and I think certification can help to really do that, is the ultimate fate, serious or otherwise, of any losses that emerge as this industry just gets bigger and bigger. And losses, of course, of ammonia then feed into the global nitrogen cycle, which involves a whole host of compounds, including N2O, which is a massive greenhouse warming gas, and of course the other NOxes, which end up as nitrite and nitrate in the environment, which is not necessarily a good thing either. So would need to be massive losses before those become significant, I suspect, in the global nitrogen cycle. But nonetheless, I think we need to keep an eye on it.
Thanks, Doug, and that conversation that you can follow in the chat box. I've got one from Emma, who's on her iPhone. Emma, did you want to pose that question there? It was around verification of raw data, I believe.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, my internet dropped out for a bit, but I'm back on my laptop. Yeah, so much of this has also been going on in the chat, and I think I want to make one point, and that is there are all sorts of things that could make the certification scheme more convenient and appealing for some parties, but we really need to make sure that we don't end up undermining the ultimate trust of consumers in the certification scheme, because that is really the whole point of the certification scheme. And so one of those elements is, of course, you know, how do we know Siemens has happily got all its systems sucking up information, but I still don't understand how that captures, you know, the things like the fugitive emissions from LNG produced ammonia and similar issues perhaps with the leakage of ammonia. If someone could enlighten me, thanks.
Yeah, no, that's really, I mean, it's critical. This is all about trust, and fully agree. I see, and this also speaks to what the topic Doug was mentioning. If we measure at point of production and we measure at point of loading, let's say it's produced and loaded onto a ship, and we measure at the point of unloading, and ultimately we measure at points of dispatch, if we're talking about hydrogen, and you talk about measuring the amount of hydrogen being dispensed into a fuel cell car. So if we measure at every point, then we can account for losses. Fugitive emissions are very difficult, though. Fugitive by their nature and definition, I guess. You know, you can't put a meter on it. I think that would be somewhat difficult, and I think there you have to do it in the same way that we do today, which is, you know, some sort of benchmarking calculation addition, which in the case of LNG is the case. But and that's where we have to be careful that yeah, LNG might have that topic, but when you talk about water electrolysis that's eminently measurable, and metering points from there on are, I think, again, eminently measurable, and therefore can be designed. And if you, and I know you mentioned there the data taken up by Siemens, so data taken up by anyone, and that's critical, that this data is not owned by the receiver of the data, by the host platform. This is not, that data does not or should not belong to that. The data should always be retained by the creator of that data, and therefore accessible in that sense and auditable. Yeah, people, we see it today when large companies take data and then misuse data, the trust breaks down very quickly.
Thanks.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Martin. I've got a question here from Anna Freeman to the panel. Anna, did you want to pose that one?
Sure, sorry, let me just start my video. I just wanted to, sorry about the poor lighting, which is why I'm not on video too. I guess there is a process currently underway where the DISA, the federal department's currently considering how it might handle the certification for hydrogen. To what degree does the panel think that that process should be treating ammonia as a central part of that certification scheme question, or is it something that can be and should be determined after the hydrogen certification framework is worked out?
Yeah, my view on that is, because we're seeing momentum in the hydrogen certification scheme, that should be left to run ahead. And if I'm allowed to be a bit provocative, I just don't see ammonia being at the same level of development. However, the hydrogen people, I'm a member of the policy committee at the Australian Hydrogen Council, where we discussed this just the other day. And we all agreed that right from the outset, some of the first carriers that must be included are ammonia. We also talked about liquid hydrogen. And we said that because those two are relatively easy, because we know where the nitrogen is going to come from. So that's quite easy. And hydrogen, well, it's just liquid, you know. It becomes more difficult once you talk about the carbon-based carriers. So for example, methanol, because then you get into the question, well, where did your carbon come from? And so we talked in terms of a minimal viable product. And personally, and that's why I illustrated the Slido I did, personally, I'm a fan that we build something based on hydrogen, because ammonia is almost immediately able to be integrated, rather than trying to build something separate for ammonia or anything else, because you've got to leverage the momentum that's underway, and that does exist in hydrogen. Yeah.
I just want to have a question here for Sam, and it was from Mark again, but Mark Hinman again, and it was around, again, geological storage. So I think that the question is, does Fortescue have allocated options for geological storage, or do they have plans to do that, to manage a value chain for supply of hydrogen or for ammonia? I hope I got that right, Mark.
Yeah, and just a little bit more context where I'm actually going with this is, as the economy grows with this, I mean, we've got to think of obviously grid balancing, and with gas, it's a lot easier to grid balance the power utilities than it is directly with batteries. So there is a huge advantage there with balancing the grid and power demand if it's actually in the gas format, because in geologic format, the reservoir, it is a battery, yeah? So that's the benefit of it.
So Sam, hopefully you've got some thoughts there on that.
And good question. And I guess storage is just one aspect, and not only storage of the hydrogen, but the storage of the ammonia and how you use it and when you produce it and what part of the season. So in terms of geological, that's one storage mean that obviously we do consider, but there's other mediums of how we will store it, and that's obviously for the domestic market and obviously the export market, and depending on what the path is, or obviously both paths as well.
Okay. Perfect. Hopefully that answered. All right. We've got another question here. don't mind, we'll move on to the next one. And we've got a question here from Brett Cooper to Penelope and Martin around the Japanese Green Ammonia Consortium. Brett, did you want to speak up and also say where you're from as well? That'd be helpful. Thanks.
Hi, Brett Cooper here from Renewable Hydrogen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. One of the things that we mentioned at the last conference, and we may mention again later in this conference, is that there could be a case for Australia to assemble a green ammonia supply consortium to work with the type of consortium that Muraki-san is representing on the offtake side in Japan. Now, assuming that we were to establish such a thing here in Australia, do you think there'd be enough heft or weight between those two organisations such that if we agreed a certification system, it could possibly be adopted worldwide? That is, a major supplier and a major off-taker agreed on what a system was. Could that be a way of getting it to happen?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. And I wouldn't say no to that, yeah, having been an observer in the hydrogen industry, and it's been talked about for a while, I'm just seeing a greater amount of momentum. And my view would be that if you can, separately from the association, work together to get the trade underway, which absolutely should happen, strongly support that. But for the certification part, to piggyback on the activities taking place for hydrogen so that you leverage that existing momentum to get there faster up, that would be my personal point of view.
So yeah, I can totally see Martin's point. At the same time, when it comes to international discussions about ammonia certification versus hydrogen, I don't think IPHE, if Martin, you're thinking of that as the forum, the International Partnership for the Hydrogen Economy is the major intergovernmental negotiating body for hydrogen certification. They're not, as far as I'm aware, negotiating ammonia certification yet. And obviously we have things like Certify, which is the European hydrogen certification system, which is very well developed relative to any other system. But the Europeans don't have an ammonia certification system. And as far as I'm aware, it's not a high priority for Europe. Perhaps their distances, for instance, pipelines are more feasible for Europe, so they don't need to fast track ammonia. If you look at the other interests, how Australia's interests and say Japan's interests might differ from the Americans or from the Europeans, I think then our interests are slightly different perhaps, and perhaps ammonia could be a higher priority for us given the vast distances. We need to transport hydrogen fuels to get them to their destination markets. And as I said in my presentation, I don't see this as an either or. I think, of course, any certification system that Australia and Japan negotiated bilaterally, for instance, should be informed about discussions happening in other regions by other countries, multilateral, bilateral, or regional. But that said, whatever system ends up happening globally or bilaterally needs to work for Australia's industry and the Asian region, where we might be a little different to some of the other regions. So I think these things need to happen probably simultaneously, and they need to happen in a very interactive way, so you don't have the global system not meeting Australia's needs or Japan's needs, and our bilateral system also being consistent with a global system, so there's interoperability. Ideally, of course, you just have the global system negotiated and everyone signs on to it and we're all hunky-dory and agree with each other. But as we know, multilateral negotiations can take many, many years with many, many different interests, and that might not meet the immediate needs of the people who want to start shipping green ammonia to Japan in the next 3 years. It's just my personal perspective.
Yeah, actually, that's quite good. I fully agree that this is a bit of a unique circumstance. I think Europeans aren't going to get as excited about using ammonia as an energy carrier, whereas between Japan and Australia, that makes perfect sense. And I think that's the beauty of these panels and these sessions, isn't it? It brings different points of views together. And perhaps coming back to your original question, maybe I stand corrected. And if Australia and Japan together would probably be able to set the trend. So yeah, thanks. It's always great to hear perspectives. That's why we do these.
Martin, if I can add to that, I think Australia has shown in the resources sector, not just only Fortescue, but we have the ability to impact the world stage on what we do, whether it's different innovations, whether it's ammonia or hydrogen certification. I think by partnering up with the right organisations and the right companies, I think we've got the proven experience to do that, and I think we will. It does highlight the difference between. I do like the conversations highlighted our unique scenario in terms of the vast land and the distances between cities versus the European situation. But you know, going back to the point, I have no doubt that we have the ability to influence that as we have done in the past.
I wonder whether we could see Meraki's views on this. I think he might be online.
Yeah. Yes, I think there was a yes. There's a question. I think you wanted to pose a question as well, Meraki-san.
Yeah. I want to comment on the certification process. I fully agree with the Penelope's comment. We want to go the bilateral between Australia and Japan, and eventually we need to establish an international, robust, and sustainable certifications. But it will take many years to do that. And also, if we look and discuss the certification, there are two major aspects. One is how to make a lower carbon fuels. The other hand is that what is the commercial viable low carbon fuel? If that it goes to the stringent control of the certification, the cost will move up. So what is the reasonable and practical certification we can establish between export country and import country? I think that the hydrogen certification can be reflected to the ammonia certifications. However, because of the time frame, we are trying to start the commercial trade of the carbon-free ammonia in few years' time. So we need to go bilateral first and establish between Australia and Japan and start the trade of the green or blue ammonia. But my question is how that can be moved to the international certifications, and if we can establish the bilateral certification between Australia and Japan, that will have a big impact on the establishment of the international certificate. Or if we go to this international certificate, some countries has more interest on the lower carbon certificate. That kind of conflict and we may have, and can have a different certification process. That's I a bit wonder, a concern.
I might try to answer that. I think we already see in the global negotiations for a hydrogen certification system, for instance, and I again note these are not ammonia certification systems at this stage. The Europeans have been talking within their region, inside the EU, for many years about hydrogen certification. And they first set up bilateral and trilateral, I'm sure, arrangements for the members of the EU. And then, of course, they go to the international organization and they have an EU sort of region approach. So I imagine, you know, again, probably the Americas also, they do things bilaterally and multilaterally, and their bilateral approaches inform their multilateral approaches. And I guess the question is, with Australia being a key energy exporter into the Asian region, how do we approach perhaps our bilateral, Japan, Korea, Singapore? You know, there are many countries in our region which will be key to our export sector. And then how do we link perhaps those bilateral approaches as they land into the multilateral negotiations? And as I said, all of these things are actually happening simultaneously. And so, again, the multilateral dominant approaches that are already agreed within, say, IPHE or whatever body ends up governing ammonia certification, you know, those common approaches need to be hopefully informing our approach and everyone else's approach. So it's a complex, and I'm sure there are negotiators, and there's research actually underway at ANU about, you know, the harmonisation of international systems for hydrogen certification. So stay tuned for when that publication comes out.